In this video, we're going to be talking about the aspects of Egyptian society as well as the Middle Kingdom, which we are going to contrast with the Old Kingdom, which is what we have been talking about in class. So as you can see with this lovely image here that we have, ancient Egypt was structured in a social hierarchy, right? That we have distinct social classes where the pharaoh is at the top as a living god, and then below him are all of these other workers at various jobs and various levels of society. In ancient Egypt, as in most places in the ancient world, there was very limited opportunity for social mobility. People really did not move up or down this hierarchy really at all. The only the only way really you could do that is if you learned how to read or write, or really became involved in the priests or priestesses. So very similar to Mesopotamia. But most people, right, if you were born a farmer or a laborer, you died a farmer or a laborer, and your kids were the same. And same thing with, artisans and governors even, right, that this was all kind of a patchwork of royal family, connections and stuff like that. So there really was no social mobility. And that gives us a society that's what we call stratified. Stratified really just means that there's distinct social classes. It's a vocab term that you should know, right? So strata really just means like a segment or a well-defined area. So geologists talk about strata in the earth, right, where you can see the different rock formations. So social stratification is the same concept, right? Is that there's very defined social classes. So let's start at the top. So the pharaoh technically owned everything. As a living god, you were given a lot of privileges. Everything in ancient Egypt was considered the pharaoh's property, which meant that every decision essentially went to him. Now, you might think that that means that the pharaoh was a dictator. And in some aspects, that's true. But the pharaoh couldn't do everything that he wanted. The Egyptians believed in a very conservative style of government, a small c conservative, and that they are meant to conserve the way things have been. And how they did that was that there was these two ideas that really took hold in Egyptian society. One was a religious idea called Ma'at, which basically meant balance or order, that it was the pharaoh's job to really keep things as they are. To not change all that much, because change could cause things to go bad. So everything was so good in Egypt for the most part that they wanted to keep everything the same. So balance and order was important. In fact, as we'll see when we start talking about Egyptian mythology, they even had a god, or actually a goddess, called Ma'at, whose job it was to oversee the balance of the cosmic order, right? So this was something that ancient Egyptians took very seriously. The other thing that pharaohs were kind of constrained by, or reined in by, was this idea of a legal precedent. A legal precedent is basically means that you have to follow the decisions that were made by people before you, right? And the word precedent, we see the word precede, right, to come before. So a legal precedent basically just means that a pharaoh can't just like up and change everything, right? They kind of have to follow the traditions that have been passed on from before them. This concept is really important. And in fact, our country, the United States, has been founded on this idea of legal precedent, right? Judges are not supposed to just make drastic changes to the interpretation of the law. They're supposed to follow what was ruled before them, and kind of keeping things in a nice, not radically changing things one way or the other. So while the pharaoh was a living god and had basically total control over everything, right, they were still kind of restrained by these two principles of Ma'at and of the concept of legal precedence, right? So pharaohs really deferred to a lot of their advisors, or the viziers, and other royal officials who advised the pharaoh, right? This was important. The pharaoh did not necessarily know all of the past decisions, so it was up to the advisors and the royal overseers to really help the pharaoh understand what was going on and what was decided before they took power. So you could make an argument, although I don't know that it would necessarily land, because again, the pharaoh is a god and everything belongs to him, that these advisors were really powerful, right? And maybe even part of running the government itself, what we might call a bureaucracy. Um, but these decisions were mostly delegated. The pharaoh spent most of his time not even worrying about these kinds of things. It was up to the royal overseers and the governors of ancient Egypt to really make sure that the laws are enforced and that things are done fairly. The pharaoh really didn't want anything to do with that, right? He had more important things to do. Speaking of things that the pharaoh did, the pharaoh practiced polygamy. Pharaohs had multiple wives, many wives. Some had, 10, 20, 30 wives. And that created a number of issues. First off, most of the pharaoh's wives would have been his sisters or first cousins. This would have been a way to keep the bloodline pure for the royal family, to make sure that the power stays within the family. So most pharaohs, wedded their sisters. But that also leads to issues of succession, right? Who becomes pharaoh after a pharaoh dies? If you have multiple sons, that can lead to power struggles. And in fact, we see that in ancient Egypt a lot. There are a lot of dynasties that come to power and then fade. And a lot of that has to do with fighting over who is in charge and who should be the rightful heir. You can imagine that in ancient Egypt, right, even though they did invent a calendar and were very, astute astrologers and understood time and those kinds of things, there could be competing claims for the throne, right? The oldest son might not have been the son of the most favored wife, which was sometimes used to determine who was going to be the next pharaoh. If a pharaoh died before saying who the heir apparent was, in other words, who's the next pharaoh going to be, that often led to bitter rivalries among the sons, who all thought that they were, next in line to be, the pharaoh. And one of the ways they got around this was they made, if you were the son of a pharaoh, you were a noble. You were automatically considered nobility, which gave you a pretty easy life and a good job and people to boss around and that kind of stuff. But there really wasn't that same powerful position as the pharaoh. But again, that kind of leads to this competition and this infighting that we'll see kind of throughout ancient Egypt. The other thing that's pretty common in ancient Egypt was the use of all these minor officials, right? Again, if the pharaoh's busy doing other things and has to be constrained by precedent, right, then things should go pretty easily, right? There shouldn't be much change from one pharaoh to another, or even throughout the lifetime of a pharaoh. Pretty much everything's going to be the same. So they could rely on these minor officials to make the ultimate decisions because they weren't going to change all that much. But when we talk about Egyptian society, right, this pyramid structure is really important because 80% of the population were peasants, right, or laborers, people who did not own their land that they worked on or did not own the things that they were making. They were making them for someone else. And that 80% of the population, right, that's a huge number, right? That's a huge number. And those people were used to do, government building things, as we saw with the article about who built the pyramids, right? What do you do with farmers when it's not harvesting or planting season? Well, you force them to build your tomb for you and to build these giant pyramids that are meant to symbolize how powerful and important you were. That's a really good segue into us talking about the Middle Kingdom. So if you remember, I said that ancient Egypt was divided into three distinct, or our study of ancient Egypt is divided into three distinct periods: the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms. And you also remember that I said that is a historian's perspective, right? The historians have divided this up in a way that makes sense to us, right? So that there must be some defining characteristic of each that we can look at as students of history and try to understand what was really going on during that time period. So the Old Kingdom, if you remember, I said that's pyramids, right? That's when all the pyramids in ancient Egypt were built. That's where when the Great Pyramid was built. That's an Old Kingdom kind of event or artifact or thing that happened in Egypt. So let's talk about the Middle Kingdom, because this is a change. So here we have a map, right? You can actually see the Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt kind of divisions, right? Remember keeping that correct in your head. And the Old Kingdom collapses. We're not really sure why. We think that it had to do with economics, that the economy in the region just kind of crumbled, and that led to the overthrow of the Old Kingdom. Um, some have speculated, I think probably rightly so, that when you spend 10 years and probably the equivalent of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of modern dollars into building a tomb that gets used and then never used again, that's going to lead to some pretty tough economic times for your country. So there's some unrest that leads to the collapse of the Old Kingdom. And before the Middle Kingdom comes into play, there's this intermediary period where we see the rise of strong rulers. And there's a lot of rebellions. There's a lot of attempts to overthrow the government. There's this constant struggle between the powerful and those who want power. In fact, during this intermediate period, you see the end of the power of aristocrats, all those nobles who were, sons of pharaohs. They all have their titles removed and they're just regular people. You also see these strong rulers occupying Nubia, which is the region farther south along the Nile, which is extremely rich in gold, which is where we get this concept that everything in Egypt was made of gold. That really only comes about after the fall of the Old Kingdom. Now, of course, the Old Kingdom had gold, but the fact that gold would be everywhere was something that happened once Egypt conquered Nubia, right? The area farther south in modern-day Sudan. So let's talk about the Middle Kingdom. The Middle Kingdom, the defining characteristic of the Middle Kingdom is the Hyksos. The Hyksos are a group of people who come to power in Egypt peacefully. They don't overthrow the government. They slowly work their way up through the government to eventually become pharaoh, and then they start ruling as pharaoh, right, as an Egyptian pharaoh. Now, this is important because the Hyksos were not Egyptian. They were an outside group. They were different ethnically than most ancient Egyptians, right? If you even just think of where Egypt is located, it's at a crossroads of Mesopotamia, of what we'll call the Levant region, right? Israel, Lebanon, that area, as well as Africa. There's, great resources along the Nile. This is a very popular, location. So there's people coming from all over the place, and the Hyksos were just one of them. So the Hyksos come to power peacefully, right? There's no wars that we have records of. There's not, it just all of a sudden they seem to be in power. They work their lifetimes, work their way up through the government structure. We do know that the Hyksos are responsible for bringing chariots to the Egyptians, that before the Middle Kingdom, before the rise of the Hyksos, the Egyptians did not have chariots. They did not use them in battle. And then something else that's interesting about the Hyksos, which is going to lead to things that happen throughout Egyptian history, is Egyptian culture is so, awesome, cool. They love it. They fall in love with Egyptian culture, even though they're outsiders, and they adopt it as their own. It's one of the reasons why Egyptian culture stays the same for so long, so much of Egyptian history, right? Is because all these new rulers, even if they're outsiders, take on all of the trappings and all of the aspects of Egyptian royalty. There's a reason why Cleopatra was considered a pharaoh, right? Even though she was technically Greek, also an outsider. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But that is what led to, right, these Hyksos, they loved Egyptian culture. They adopted it as their own. They changed very little of it. So you have this kind of continuity of culture that is going to become important in Egyptian history. But over time, if it's called the Middle Kingdom, you know that it's going to end, right? That's kind of within the name. So what happens? Well, eventually the Hyksos are kicked out. They were never really accepted by those traditionally in power in Egypt. They were seen as outsiders their whole time. No matter how much they adopted Egyptian culture, they were just never accepted because they were different. So they were eventually kicked out, overthrown violently, and that leads to the New Kingdom, which we will talk about next time we take notes. So in this video, we talked about Egyptian society and some of the classic Egyptian conservatism aspects of ma'at and legal precedent. We talked about the use of laborers in off seasons to do government building projects. We talked about pharaohs and their issues with succession because of their many wives. And of course, we talked about the Middle Kingdom and the rise of the Hyksos. So when we're looking at the New Kingdom, something to be thinking about, we have the Old Kingdom is characterized by pyramids. The Middle Kingdom is characterized by the Hyksos, right? That's really the main thing that distinguishes the Middle Kingdom, is the rise of this outside group to power in Egypt. So be thinking about what the thing will be for the New Kingdom when we start talking about that next time we take notes. All right, guys. Until then, I'll see you.